Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 7:30 on a Monday night, so let us get started. Good evening and welcome to lesson 5 of the JLI course Journey of the Soul. Tonight's class is entitled Where We Go Again, meant to be an adaptation of last week's class. Last week's class was called Where We Go, talking a little bit about heaven and hell. Tonight, or as we talked about last week, heaven and purgatory. Tonight is called Where We Go Again. Tonight we'll be talking a little bit about the idea of reincarnation in the Jewish faith. Before we do that, I have been asked to give over a message from JLI headquarters. They would like to know what you think about the new textbook. For those of you who are regular repeat offenders who have taken JLI courses before, you will notice the shiny new full color textbook, which has a whole bunch of new designs, etc., etc. JLI Central wants to know what you think about that. And so if you wouldn't mind terribly going to myjli.com/book survey and answering 3 quick questions, we would be forever indebted to you. But let's get to it. Journey of the Soul, lesson 5, entitled Where We Go Again. Last week, we spoke about the afterlife. We spoke about what happens to our soul once it leaves this world. Today, we're going to speak about a discussion that in a certain sense, it's very intriguing, but in a certain sense, it combines both the present life and the afterlife. And in a certain sense, the question that we're going to be posing to each and every one of us is, are we living in what is our present life and somebody else's afterlife? Judaism believes in the fascinating idea of reincarnation. Now, interestingly enough, I believe it might be true that some of you actually signed up for the course specifically to have this conversation. Reincarnation is something which is very, very intriguing to people. In fact, in 2017, there was a Pew survey in which 33% of US adults said they believe in reincarnation. What is most fascinating to me about that statistic is that it included 75% of Americans who identify as atheists. So even people who don't necessarily believe in organized religion or in any sort of faith structure or anything of the sort, they were interested, or at least said that they believed in the concept of reincarnation, which is what we're going to be talking about with God's help this evening. Obviously, reincarnation is a cloudy topic. Obviously, reincarnation is a very convoluted topic, but hopefully tonight we'll be able to cover the basics and have you, I'd say, walking out of here or have you zooming out of here, having covered the very basics of the topic. I want to start tonight on page 174 of your student textbook with an emotional question. And I preface that very intentionally because we're going to have an emotional part of the conversation and then we're going to have a more intellectual part of the conversation. So the question for all of you is, how do you feel about the concept of soul reincarnation? Are you fascinated with, perhaps even charmed by the idea, or does it disturb you? Everyone is welcome to unmute themselves, to come on mic, or to chat at me and tell me how they feel about reincarnation. Not what do you think about it. When you hear the idea, objectively, how does it make you feel? Go ahead. Jeff, go ahead.
Oh, hello, Rabbi.
How are you, sir?
I'm good. It makes me feel both excited and a little bit of a heavier feeling of responsibility as well.
Tell me about excited. Why does it make you excited?
I think that the idea of many journeys and many experiences is quite exciting. And in life, one can only do so much.
I like that.
See so much, and so that's good.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you for calling into the show. Who else wants to share their thoughts? How do they feel about the idea of reincarnation? Jay says, interesting, not disturbed at all. Kira, how do you feel about reincarnation?
I think it makes me feel a little bit hopeful that it's not just a complete black oblivion.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. Good. Hold on a second. We have someone else who's trying to enter our classroom. Anybody else want to talk about their feelings of reincarnation? So interestingly enough, if you poll most people about this topic, you will get answers that usually are on opposite ends of the spectrum. What do I mean by opposite ends of the spectrum? Well, by and large, some people, I think a little bit what was shared here earlier this evening, some people are very intrigued by the topic. Some people like the idea of having a connection to the past, and not just having a connection to the past, but having a connection to the future. At the end of the day, a lot of the topics that we've been talking about in the context of this class sometimes might make us feel like a fleeting, insignificant speck in the timeline of history. We're here for a little bit, and then our soul goes off into the eternal, and that's pretty much all there is for us. Reincarnation says there's more to the picture. We don't just come into existence now. Our existence doesn't end at a point in time. There is a lot more to our existence than we might see in the present. We actually have a past, we actually have a future, and there's a lot to us that we may not be able to see with our physical eyes in the present. On the other hand, there are many that are disturbed by the concept of reincarnation. Some people who are disturbed by the concept of reincarnation is for the very simple idea that they feel that it denies them a personal identity. We'd like to think that we are ourselves, we are the best version of ourselves, we are living our best lives, and ultimately the only person who can determine the version of the lives that we will live is ourselves. They seem to feel that reincarnation makes us sound like some sort of version of recycled or God forbid, damaged goods. And for a lot of people, that notion is actually a little bit unfair. Not only do I have to contend with the issues that I have in this present reality of myself, but I come into this life with a whole host of baggage of all my issues from my previous life and the life before that and the life before that and the life before that. And so for a lot of people, the idea of reincarnation is not necessarily something that they particularly connect with when hearing the idea and discussing how they feel about it. But beyond that, now that we've talked about our feelings about reincarnation, let's get into the idea of reincarnation just a little bit. Let's do a little exercise together on page 175 of your student textbook, what's marked exercise 5.1. This is going to be a very straightforward true or false exercise, okay? You're back in school, you're taking a true or false examination. Right? Take back in school, take a true or false examination. True or false examination. What is what's going on? Okay, sorry about that. We are going to do a little bit of a true or false exercise. I'd like, please join me on page 175 of your student book. We're going to use the chat function for this, as I feel it is what allows us to do this best. True or false? Belief in reincarnation is basic to Judaism. Throughout this course, we've talked a lot about Jewish basic ideas. Is reincarnation a basic belief to Judaism? True or false? That is a statement. Would you say that statement is true or false? Feel free to chat at me. Just give me a T or an F. True, true. We'll give it one more second. Okay, true, good. Let's move on to question 2. In the Jewish view, reincarnation means that a soul that inhabited one body returns to inhabit another. True or false? I got a true from Jeff, a true from Jay, true from Laura, a false from John. I see a little bit of diversity in the class tonight. This is good. I like this very much. Good. Number 3, a human soul can be reincarnated in a non-human entity, such as an animal or a plant. True or false? Can we come back in some other version of ourselves? False, says Jeff. True, says Jay. False, says Marvin. False, says Laura. Okay. We're getting some variety of thought tonight. Number 4, a reincarnated soul does not have its own identity, but shares its identity with someone who lived in a previous lifetime. True or false? I've got a false, 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 false. Okay, that seems to be pretty unanimous for the most part. Okay, number 5. The purpose of doing good in one's current lifetime is to be reincarnated as a person of higher status. Ultimately, all we hope to accomplish in this lifetime is to come back as a better dressed version of ourselves. Would that be true or false? When I am reincarnated, I want to have a beard like my friend Damien. The one that they gave me in this lifetime is not very impressive for a rabbi. I'd like to have something far more impressive. False from Jeff, false from Mara Joshua McCarthy. True, depending on how you define status. Okay, good, Laura. I'd like a little bit of nuance there. Number 6. Number 6. A soul is reincarnated as a penalty for sins committed in a prior life. False, says John. False, says Marvin. False, says Laura. False says the trio. False from Jay. Good. Number 7, last but not least, most souls today are reincarnations. True or false? True from Marvin. True from Jeff. Maybe from Laura. Laura, you're getting political on me. We're trying to nail you down to a yes or no answer. Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. All righty. Let's get to it. Let's start with an easy one. Let's start with a very, very easy one. Before we go any further, let us acknowledge that indeed reincarnation, I know the question in the true or false section of class was about what is basic to Judaism, but let's acknowledge the fact that reincarnation is something which is very much part and parcel of our faith. It is definitely something which the Jewish faith believes in. What we're quoting in text 1 is actually taken from the Siddur, from parts of prayers that we say every day. In fact, it's taken from the prayers that we say every night before retiring, before bed, in which we ask God to forgive us for all the sins we may have committed during that day. And we say as follows: Master of the universe, page 176 in your book. Master of the universe, I hereby forgive anyone who has angered or vexed me or sinned against me, either physically or financially, against my honor or anything else that is mine, whether accidentally or intentionally, inadvertently or deliberately, by speech or by deed, in this incarnation or in any other. This is part of the daily prayers. This is something which I say every night before retiring, before bed. I ask God to forgive anyone who I may have offended during the day, whether they are in this incarnation or a different incarnation. The thing about reincarnation that we really have to grapple with as we start our conversation tonight is the fact that reincarnation is a very loaded word, a very, very heavy word, which might mean a great variety of things. They tell the story, now it's flu season, it's March 1st, it's a year of COVID, but yes, Laura, it does sound much like Yom Kippur. It's a very similar text. But they tell the story about a guy who enters a doctor's office and walks up to the receptionist and says, "Excuse me, ma'am, I've got shingles." And the nurse says, "Oh my, you do? Okay, here's a form. Please fill this out with all of your information. Please fill it out, and when you're finished, bring it back to the front desk." So the guy sits down and he brings the form back to the desk, and the nurse's aide comes out, and they send the guy back, and they say to the nurse's aide, "What does he have?" "He has shingles." Nurse's aide takes him back, examines him, puts him in the doctor's room. The doctor comes in, inspects him from head to toe and says, "I'm sorry, sir, I have not found one single symptom of shingles anywhere on your body." The guy says, "That's because they're not on my body. I have all the shingles in my truck, and I want you to know where you'd like me to put the shingles." When you walk into a doctor's office and say that you have shingles, it could mean a great variety of things. And based on exactly what kind of shingles you have and what you're meant to do with said shingles, well, that would determine where exactly we send you and what we do with you. So we're talking a lot about reincarnation. We believe in reincarnation. We're not sure we believe in reincarnation. Judaism seems to believe in reincarnation. The question that we're really going to talk about tonight is, what exactly is this reincarnation that we are talking about? Now, the one thing that's unique about tonight's class is that in tonight's class, we're sharing a lot of, I guess what I'd say, objectively true information. So we're sharing text that comes from great, very mystical books of Kabbalah, which share the ideas the way they are. I'm not telling you that this is something which I necessarily agree with or vouch for. I'm telling you that this is what it says in the book. And, this is what it says in the book. It's really kind of something difficult to argue with in that sense, but let's see how it goes. And let's see how everyone is able to stomach all the information that we're going to go through tonight. Let's start with a very basic fundamental question before we talk about how reincarnation works or if reincarnation works. Let's start with a very, very basic question. We have spoken at great length over the past few Monday nights about the journey of the soul. Hence, the name of this course is Journey of the Soul. And we have talked about the fact that the time that the soul spends enveloped in the body here on earth is just a small blip on the radar. And once it finishes its time here in the body here on earth, it goes back to the eternal trove of souls and it experiences eternal bliss up above in the eternal trove of souls. If we're to understand that souls come back down, they go back up, they come back down, they go back up, they come back down, when does our soul experience this eternal bliss that we talked about specifically in last week's class when we talked about Gan Eden, we talked about heaven? It sounds like on a certain level that all our soul is doing is just kind of constantly taking short-term trips back down here. So all the ideas of the afterlife that we have been discussing what is the end? When is the end of the journey that our soul embarks into that entire world that we've been talking about, if there seems to be this idea that souls spend some time up there and then come back down? So the one text that we'll be drawing from very heavily tonight is actually a book called Shar HaGilgulim, which would literally be translated as the Gate of the Reincarnations, which was written by the foremost disciple, the most preeminent disciple of the Arizal, of the great Kabbalist, the author of the Zohar, Rabbi Isaac Luria. His student was Reb Chaim Vital, and he wrote a book called Shar HaGilgulim, which is pretty much the most authoritative text on the concept of reincarnations, and it is that text that we'll be drawing from today. And in order to understand the idea of reincarnations, he starts us off with a very, very basic idea. Let's join together in text 2 on page 177. It says Reb Chaim Vital, It all began with one master soul, the soul of Adam, which included all future souls. Subsequently, this master soul passed on to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and was then divided among the 12 tribes. Afterwards, the soul was further partitioned among the 70 souls, the descendants of Jacob, that accompanied him to Egypt, and eventually among the 600,000 souls who left Egypt. What does it have to do with anything? Again, the question that we're struggling with, if the soul that's reincarnated, when does it experience Gan Eden or Gehenna, as we talked about in last week's class? And so Reb Chaim Vital explains, etc. Let's talk about the history of Jewish souls. According to Reb Chaim Vital, in looking at the history of Jewish souls, it would be more appropriate to say the history of the Jewish soul. Initially, there was just one soul, which was the soul of Adam. Adam's soul eventually split itself up into 3 other souls, which would be the souls of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Eventually, that master soul, which was then tripled off into 3 master souls, split itself off into the souls of the 12 tribes of Israel. From the 12 tribes of Israel, it went to the 70 souls of Jacob's family that ultimately accompanied him down to Egypt, and then it completely metastasized and turned into the 600,000 root souls, which are the root souls of every Jewish soul that will ever live. So in thinking about the concept of reincarnation, I think the first most important idea is thinking of the idea of a tree that begins with a single trunk, and ultimately it divides itself and further subdivides itself into many limbs and branches and twigs. And every time it divides itself and launches another offshoot, that offshoot begins to live on its own, just like the idea exists in biology. Every organism starts as a single cell, which ultimately splits itself up and breaks up into a great many parts. This is how the Shar HaGilgulim explains the idea of souls. It started with one, that split off, those split off, those further split off, and so on and so forth. With that in mind, let's see for a second what Laura says over here. Why no soul for Eve? What about Eve's soul? I see a lot of questions about Eve's soul. Since Adam was alive when she was created, where did her soul come from and ultimately go? So the answer to both of those questions is that Adam and Eve are the embodiment of every Jewish couple that would ever live, in the sense that they were truly soulmates, and they shared a soul that was split in half at birth and went half male, half female. And this is not the class to talk about the idea of soulmates, how in the Jewish faith, we literally believe in the concept of soulmates, that every spouse, 2 spouses share a soul. How exactly that works is not the conversation for now, but that's what we talk when we talk about Adam's soul. We are speaking about the soul of Adam and Eve. When we speak about Abraham's soul, we're speaking about the soul of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebecca, and so on and so forth. With that idea of this offshoot of souls spreading forth, let's continue in the text of the Shar HaGilgulim text 3 on page 178. Furthermore, you must know that every person must fulfill all of the 613 mitzvot. If a soul does not fulfill all of the 613 mitzvot in action, speech, and thought, it must be reincarnated until it completes them all. Explains Reb Chaim Vital. The soul, when it comes down into this world, has a mission. It has a number of missions, but let's start enumerating those missions. Mission number 1 is to reveal God's presence. Mission number 2 is to fulfill all 613 mitzvot. And mission number 3 is to rectify and elevate both body and soul. Now, mission number 1 and mission number 3 are relatively easy to talk about how that gets done. It's not an absolute goal. The soul could do a great number of things to reveal God's presence in the world or to rectify and elevate both body and soul. But fulfilling all 613 mitzvot is quite a tall task. In fact, explain the mystics, all 600,000 of those root souls stood at the foot of Mount Sinai when God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, when the Jewish people became God's nation. And at that moment, upon becoming God's nation, every single soul that was present was commanded to fulfill all 613 mitzvot in the Torah. Each one of them were given that responsibility. The reality is that it is quite difficult to fulfill all 613 mitzvot in a person's lifetime. Beyond the fact that it's difficult to fulfill all 613 mitzvot, it is also difficult not to sin during our lifetime. That's a pretty lofty expectation. The soul is sent down into this world to fulfill the mitzvot, to rectify the body through the performance of the mitzvot, and not to get bogged down by evil. Reality is most souls, when they get sent down into this world, are not able to discharge that mission to a T. What happens to a soul that is not able to fulfill its mission in this world? If it's not able to fulfill its mission in this world, ultimately that soul gets reincarnated so that it will one day be able to fulfill the exact mission given to it by God. So, building block number one. Where does the idea of reincarnation come from? Reincarnation is a Jewish idea in the Jewish faith to give every soul the opportunity to fulfill all 613 mitzvot. That's why the concept of reincarnation exists. That is the only reason why God went ahead and created this whole idea, is to allow the soul to complete its mission. The soul, every one of those 600,000 root souls has that mission, has that obligation, and God put in place the mechanism of reincarnation to make it more feasible for each soul to do so. Beyond fulfilling all 613 mitzvot, which, make no mistake, is an astronomically large task unto itself, there is another responsibility that the soul has. Let's continue on page 178, text number 4 from the Shar HaGilgulim. You should also realize that each individual must study all 4 of the Torah's layers, which are referred to by their acronym as Pardes, Hebrew for orchard. These are Peshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod, the literal, the allusion, the exegetic, and the mystical. It is necessary for a soul to be reincarnated repeatedly until it completes them all. Explains the Shar HaGilgulim, the soul has another responsibility. And the responsibility is the soul must study all 4 layers of the Torah. What are these 4 layers of the Torah that we speak of, and how exactly do they work? Please enjoy the following fascinating lesson video.
Human authors express themselves in their works, both directly and subtly, sometimes intentionally and always subconsciously. When we read a text, we can choose either to read the lines or to engage in more intricate analysis and read between the lines. The divine author of the Torah did something similar, but to an infinitely greater degree. God expressed himself in the text in multiple ways all at once, directly as well as subtly, with plenty of insinuation and a vast hidden layer of the divine subconscious. And he then instructed us to excavate it all. Jewish tradition separates these layers of understanding into 4 categories. The first is Peshat, direct intention, which is derived by examining context and syntax. For example, the Torah begins with the words, Bereshis bara Elokim, es hashemayim, ve'es ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. On the plainest level of Torah understanding, this is a straightforward statement of what happened at the beginning of time. But the simple meaning is not always easy to clarify. Many biblical commentators, most notably Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, the 11th century French scholar known universally as Rashi, devoted their efforts to clarifying the straightforward meaning of the often mysterious biblical texts. Our second layer of understanding is remez, allusion. This refers to subtle communications that are encoded in the text. They can be uncovered using methods such as the numerical values of the Hebrew letters, the acronyms of words and phrases, or unusually sized letters in the Torah scroll. For example, the Torah's first two words, Bereshis bara, in the beginning, God created, carry the numerical value of 1116. That's the identical value of the phrase Barosh Hashanah Nivra. It was created on Rosh Hashanah. We are thereby informed that Rosh Hashanah is the anniversary of creation. Our third layer of understanding is drush, interpretive. Our sages extrapolate a vast corpus of ideas and instruction from the Torah's text through methods such as textual comparison, sequencing analysis, and homiletical interpretation. For example, from a sequencing perspective, the Torah begins with the wrong beginning. It describes creation, a narrative that is seemingly secondary to the Torah's primary function as a book of guidance that tells us how God expects us to act on a daily basis. The Torah should have dived directly into the nitty-gritty of the laws. On the interpretive level, however, the Torah first describes creation to tackle a major hurdle to Torah observance. The majority of Torah laws rely on the Jewish nation owning and settling the land of Israel. We were instructed to conquer the land and never relinquish our claim of ownership over it. But such a radical claim to a territory is bound to provoke opposition. Who gives us the right to take possession of a land and claim it as our eternal heritage? The Torah, therefore, begins with creation, clarifying that God is the creator of all territories, and he has the right to permanently bequeath a specific parcel to a particular people. It then records the history of God doing precisely that with the Jewish people. With this switch in sequence, the Torah supplies the Jews with the response God expects them to provide all who accuse them of land theft and occupation. The fourth layer of understanding is sod, hidden meaning. This refers to the deeply mystical messages that float behind every phrase and letter in the Torah. For example, the word Bereshis can be split perfectly into two words, bara, shis, meaning he created six. God first formed the six emotive divine attributes, from chesed, kindness, through yesod, attachment, as described in Jewish mysticism. God then used these six attributes to create the actual universe. So there you have a sampling of the four layers of understanding that can be found in the Torah's very first words. Beyond this, a vast ocean of knowledge is contained in these same words. And beyond that stretches the infinite vastness of wisdom contained in the rest of the Torah's close to 80,000 words.
So there are four ways of understanding every single word of the Torah. Just to kind of recap what we just saw in the video. There is pshat, the simple explanation. There is remez, hints and allusions that are included beyond the surface. There is drash, expounding and extrapolating from even a deeper level. And ultimately there is sod, there is the esoteric explanation of the stories that seem to be pretty straightforward on their face. Explains Reb Chaim Vital in the Shar HaGilgulim. Each one of these four levels has 600,000 elements. In fact, we know, before we get to the three deeper ones, on the most basic level of Torah, throughout the Chumash and all of the different books which stem from the Chumash, Mishnah and Talmud, etc., there could be an extremely straightforward, relatively dry verse, basic verse, which has a number of different basic level commentaries arguing about what that very straightforward verse says. And they're all entitled to their opinions because to each of their souls, their interpretation is correct. So Reb Chaim Vital says that each one of those soul roots, the 600,000 soul roots, has an obligation to study every word of Torah at all four levels, Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod, until it taps into its particular interpretation of Torah on each level. With this idea in mind that there is a personal connection to Torah for every single soul, we gain insight into a very interesting expression that exists in every single prayer that we say every single day of the year. Take a look at text 5a on page 179 in the Siddur. May it be your, we say at the end of the Amidah, every single day, multiple times a day. May it be your will, our God and God of our fathers, the holy temple be rebuilt speedily in our days. Okay, that's a pretty understandable request. Rebuild the holy temple, we could work with that. And grant us our portion in your Torah. As opposed to what? As opposed to who else's portion? It's all our Torah. What does it mean, our portion in your Torah? Explains the Rebbe. Let's read text 5b together. As explained in numerous sources, the soul of each Jew has a specific segment of the Torah with which it is particularly associated. This explains the phrasing of our sage's statement, grant us our portion in your Torah. Our portion implies that each of us has a unique portion within the Torah. This concept is further expressed in our sage's statement that there are novel Torah concepts that an accomplished student of the Torah is destined to introduce. In other words, the entire universe anticipates the birth of this particular diligent student, awaiting the moment that the student innovates, meaning uncovers this specific concept within the Torah. For this concept is this student's portion of the Torah. So every root soul is waiting to study Torah on every level. And beyond that, it also must uncover and reveal its particular special passage of the Torah. This was a mission and a divine responsibility that was given to each of the 600,000 root souls that left Egypt. To recap, what are we demanding from every single soul that is a member of the Jewish people? Take a look at figure 5.1 on page 181 of your book. We're asking every soul to do three things, only three things. Number one, fulfill all 613 commandments. Number two, study the Torah, the entire Torah that is, using all four different ways of interpretation. And number three, reveal its own unique part of the Torah. Until every soul is able to do that, the soul will continue to reincarnate itself. Now, Joshua and Myra and Kathy asked, what exactly does that mean? How precisely does that work? We will get there in a moment. But that is where the idea of reincarnation stems from. That's why we have a concept of reincarnation. Reincarnation is not because God is lazy or cheap and doesn't want to spend money on creating new souls and good souls, so he just keeps on recycling the old ones until they get holes in them. God sends the soul on numerous missions until it has discharged its primary responsibility of doing the three different things enumerated in figure 5.1. Says Laura, it sounds like those who have recently become involved with Kabbalah skipped the first three and went directly to Sod. Laura Green, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that comment. As yes, there's this idea recently, just like in connection with the idea of psychology, there has recently come around the idea of pop psychology, which means that someone picks up a book they bought in Barnes and Noble and all of a sudden has their master's in psychology, has a doctorate in psychology because they read a book. The same thing applies to plumbing the depths of the Torah. People pick up an interesting book or read an article on BuzzFeed, and all of a sudden they're quoting deep esoteric ideas of the Torah. Laura raises an excellent point that these four levels of interpretation are very intentionally stacked one on top of the other. And one should arrive at the esoteric explanations only after having properly studied the other ones first and having gained a proper understanding of Torah. Yes, that is true. Excuse me. Are there any other questions before we continue? Questions, comments, criticisms, or suggestions? No. Okay. With that in mind, yes, sir. Who is this?
Jay.
Yes.
What about what's the origin of the souls in non-Jews, and where do they come from?
Excellent question. There is an idea of reincarnation in the souls of non-Jews. The souls that we are speaking about primarily throughout this entire course are Jewish souls that have a unique divine spark inside them, according to Jewish understanding, and thus they have a specific mission to fulfill all 613 mitzvot, which obviously does not ring the same for non-Jews, as they don't have the same level of divine responsibility that Jewish souls have. So sure, there is a concept of non-Jews having a soul and having their particular mission, but it's not as in depth, I guess I'd say, as the Jewish soul's responsibility, as the list of responsibilities for each of the Jewish souls is quite tedious. Non-Jews do have a life force that keeps them going. And we're going to learn tonight about how souls on different levels interact with one another, but they are a soul of a different brand than what we are speaking about tonight. Jay, does that work for you?
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. My pleasure. Okay. So to this point, Cheryl, do you have a question? No. To this point, we talked a little bit about what is reincarnation, or I should say, to be more specific, why there is reincarnation. The question that we're going to talk about now, which is specifically Myra, Joshua, and Kathy's question, is how does reincarnation come about? So does that mean that Jews will only reincarnate as Jews? Myra, Joshua, and Kathy, hold that question until the end of class. I promise we will get to that. But now we're going to discuss the earlier question of Myra, Joshua, and Kathy, which is how exactly does that go? How exactly does that happen? Or to put the question in their words, there are more than 600,000 people. How are the rest accounted for? Text 6, page 182. Again, we're quoting from our friend this evening, Reb Chaim Vital, in the Shar HaGilgulim, and he says as follows. Although we've stated in numerous passages of this treatise that a specific individual soul was reincarnated in a particular person, and it was subsequently reincarnated in another specific individual, and so on, do not misread this as implying that the original soul itself is reincarnated repeatedly. Rather, each human soul branches out into innumerable roots. Every root contains an infinite quantity of soul sparks. With each subsequent reincarnation, a number of these sparks are rectified, and they ascend to enjoy the rewards of heaven and dwell in the particular strata of Gan Eden, of heaven, that are appropriate for them. However, those soul sparks that were not rectified are reincarnated to provide further opportunity for rectification. With this in mind, we're going to dispel the single greatest myth about reincarnation. In fact, the perception that most of us have about how reincarnation works is largely inaccurate. The root souls that we have been discussing tonight, by definition of their being root souls, are capable of generating other souls. Each one of the souls that the root soul generates contains sparks of godliness within them that must be elevated. Once the soul elevates one of those sparks, let's think of that spark as a part of the soul. That spark goes up to heaven where it remains forever. The good that we do in this world is never subject to a redo, to a do-over, to a recount. That spark goes up to heaven and dwells in the bliss of godliness forever. However, what about the sparks that were sent down in our soul that were not rectified? What about the good things that we were meant to do in this world that for one reason or another we never got around to doing? What then? Explains Jewish mysticism, those sparks are then awarded to another soul, to a different soul. And here's the key word, to a new soul. Those sparks are then given to a new soul, which is also an offshoot of that root soul, to come back down into this world to rectify those sparks which were unable to be rectified the first time around. And I think the key word that I want to use over here is grafted. When one soul is not able to complete its responsibilities in this world, the root soul grafts those sparks onto another soul and asks that second soul to reincarnate the sparks that existed with the earlier soul and bring them down into this world so that they may finally be elevated. We are not recycled. We are not reused. We are not living someone's version that had previously lived and then died, and now we're just kind of doing the same thing over again. Souls are regenerated to have the ability to elevate those sparks that were not elevated the first time around. So, to recap, a soul comes down into this world. The soul comes down with sparks. Some of those sparks are rectified, some of the sparks are unrectified. The rectified sparks are represented by the mitzvot that were properly observed. The unrectified sparks are either positive mitzvot that were not performed or Torah violations that were transgressed. The rectified sparks ultimately ascend to Gan Eden, ascend to heaven. The unrectified sparks become the foundational sparks of a new soul. In fact, according to Jewish mysticism, this is where the entire idea of Gehenna, of purgatory, of the rehab center that we talked about last week, comes into play. If a soul has unrectified sparks, which are unrectified either because of a positive mitzvah that was not performed or a Torah violation that was transgressed, but not on a particularly egregious level, the soul could take all of its sparks up to the heavenly gates. The positive ones ascend to the Garden of Eden. The negative, the unrectified sparks go through a cleansing process in purgatory, and then that soul can move on from this world. In an instance where the unrectified sparks went through more severe damage, where the transgressions that happened with those unrectified sparks is more intense than we might imagine, that is when it requires a reincarnation process. In fact, in a more contemporary book of Kabbalah, it compares this to the idea of someone who has a wound in a certain limb, whether the limb can be healed or it requires amputation, God forbid. Someone who has a limb that is afflicted but it can be healed is similar to the unrectified sparks that can be cleansed in Gehenna. And somebody who has sparks that are so unrectified that the only hope for them is to be grafted onto a new soul, to be reincarnated and hope that somebody else will carry out the mission of those specific sparks, is sadly compared to someone who must amputate a very, very unhealthy limb, which is the idea of a reincarnation. The sparks are cut off from the first soul and passed on to a subsequent soul. And frankly, if in the subsequent soul, those sparks aren't rectified either, there is a reincarnation, to quote the English earlier in the Shar HaGilgulim. And those sparks will keep on getting passed on from one soul to the next until they are properly rectified and their divine mission in those sparks is recognized and realized, and those sparks can ascend to heaven. Are there any questions in the meantime? I know this is a lot of information and it's not exactly things that we're usually accustomed to speaking about. Are there any questions? Okay. If this wasn't confusing enough, it's about to get more confusing. In the Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism, beyond discussing the idea of Gilgulim, of reincarnations, Kabbalah also speaks about the idea of Ibur. The literal translation of Ibur is impregnation. At times, our souls are not reincarnated as much as they are impregnated. What exactly does it mean for the soul to be impregnated? Let's take a look at text 7a. The concept of Gilgul, reincarnation, is that a soul requiring further rectification enters the body of a child as it emerges from its mother's womb to serve as the newborn's soul. It has no permission to leave that individual until the person's destined day of death. By contrast, the concept of Ibur, soul impregnation, is that a soul enters an adult body that is already inhabited by a soul, the person's primary soul received at birth. In this case, the individual is merely impregnated with a guest soul in addition to harboring a primary soul. The individual then carries the extra soul, much as a woman carries a child in her womb. Explains the Shar HaGilgulim that there is also a concept beyond the idea of reincarnation when a soul has an entire second term to live in a body, and it is the sustaining life force of the body so long as that body should live here on this earth. There are times when a soul has partial reincarnation, when in the middle of a person's life, they receive a double dose of soul. They receive a bonus soul that is given to them for a short time after they already have a soul that is sustaining their body. Why does that work? How does that work? Let's continue in 7b. A soul experiences Ibur, impregnation, for one of two reasons. A, the impregnated soul comes to an individual for its own sake. In its previous life, it failed to perform a particular mitzvah and was therefore left lacking. This was the kind of mitzvah that was impossible to perform under the conditions of that lifetime, such as the mitzvah of yibum, chalitza, and the like. It is therefore not obligated to engage in a full-scale incarnation described earlier in this treatise. For soul impregnation is sufficient. Or B, the impregnated soul comes solely to assist an individual, to bring a person additional merit, or to guide an individual in matters of Torah and mitzvah. In this case, the impregnated soul lacks nothing for itself. So I want to answer, there's a question over here from Myra. I want to answer that question, and with this provide a little bit of context into what the idea of impregnation, which is a partial reincarnation, is referring to. A spark in the context of tonight's class is a divine mission. God wants the world to become more godly. God gives every soul specific amount of assignments in this world, things to do, how to rectify its share of this world. That's what we refer to as sparks. What's referred to throughout Jewish mysticism as nitzutzim, literally sparks, which we understand to mean specific areas which are tied to our soul, where we have the unique ability to make a difference and to elevate and to transform that area unlike anybody else. Suppose a person was given the area to make a transformation in the arena of kosher, and for whatever reason, that person did not keep kosher. They had the ability to keep kosher, they just didn't care to keep kosher. So the spark of their soul that was assigned the elevation of kosher, that was assigned to take the potato chips that they ate throughout their lifetime and elevate those potato chips to God, it missed the boat. What happens to that spark? That spark then gets assigned to a new soul that is grafted from the root soul, and the spark encloses itself in the soul, and the new soul comes down into this world enclosed in a human body and tries to elevate that spark in its second assignment. And that spark will stay with the soul for its entire second assignment because it is a spark which it failed to elevate due to its own life choices. Some of you may be aware of the fact, some of you may not be aware of the fact that there is a mitzvah in the Torah to divorce your wife, to divorce your spouse. If there is a married couple, and the married couple is not getting along, there is actually a biblical commandment for them to get divorced. Just as there is a biblical commandment for two people that are living together to get married, when two people live in conflict, they should actually get divorced. Thank God, I am happily married now for almost 7.5 years. I love my wife very much. I hope never to divorce her. How does that work? If my soul was given 613 mitzvot to fulfill, and I have no intention of divorcing my wife, and frankly, I hope she has no intention of divorcing me either, what are we supposed to do with that mitzvah? How are we supposed to refine that part of our life? Let's get really technical for a second. One of the 613 commandments, as enumerated by the Torah, is that when a Jewish king is king, he should write a Torah scroll for himself. When a Jewish king takes the throne, he should write an additional Torah scroll for himself that he should carry everywhere he goes. I have often thought about becoming a Jewish king. I think I'd make a splendid Jewish king. I have no subjects who are interested in taking me on. Maybe the 16 of you here tonight that are on Zoom, we can create a little Jewish homeland. I'll become your king and then I'll write my Torah. But short of that, how am I supposed to fulfill this mitzvah? It's one of the 613 commandments in the Torah, is for the king to write a Torah scroll. I ain't a king. What am I supposed to do? Explains Jewish mysticism that in the event that a soul has certain sparks to elevate, a soul has certain responsibilities that it is not able to elevate due to no fault of its own, it never wanted to divorce its spouse, it never became a king, etc., there will be an instance where that spark will go through a process of ibur, where that spark will graft itself onto another soul for a short moment, not for a life sentence, for a short moment, in order that it may have the opportunity to fulfill that mitzvah for a short time in another soul. Yes, Jeff. Jeff, will you take me on as your king?
Oh, I just said go on Twitter if you want to be king.
Oh, perfect. I will find myself a following on social media. I hear they're very loving and accepting on Twitter. Good idea. Thank you, Jeff. So partial reincarnation applies when there is a temporary guest soul. It is not a lifetime sentence. It is for the sake of the guest soul or it is to assist the host soul. It can be one of those two situations. Either it's for the guest soul to be there for a short while to fulfill a mitzvah it did not otherwise have the opportunity to fulfill, or it's actually to assist the host soul. If a person finds themselves in a situation where they are struggling mightily and they can use a superhuman boost, at times God will latch on another part of a soul to the host soul to give them the ability to fulfill whatever it is that they are going through. Beyond partial reincarnation, there is also the idea that we had addressed earlier in class of non-human reincarnation. Non-human reincarnation is a very, very, very common idea, actually, in Judaism. Let's read text 8 on page 185. When a human soul comes to the world and becomes soiled by sin in the process, it reincarnates in another body to rectify itself. Right? We've covered this so far. That second life is its first reincarnation. So it's the soul's second trip into this world, but we consider it the first reincarnation. If it fails to rectify itself during that lifetime, it may return in a second reincarnation, the third body version. If it again fails to find rectification, it may endure a third reincarnation, the fourth body version. After that, however, it is no longer provided opportunities for rectification via reincarnation. If a certain spark is sent into four different souls, so 3 reincarnations, and it is not able to get the job done in all those souls, it is no longer given the opportunity to make amends through human reincarnation. Instead, it suffers a most uncomfortable punishment. Let's read text 9. Behold, quoting from the book of Job, behold, God does all these twice or thrice with man. The limitation of twice or thrice applies with man, meaning that a human soul is not subsequently reincarnated in a human body. Rather, it is forced to wander the planet until it is reincarnated in an inanimate, vegetative, or animal entity. Then after it has done its penance, there is hope for its future, for God's endless mercies extend to all of his creations. Non-human reincarnation only happens after 3 unsuccessful reincarnations, and to be frank, it is a form of punishment. When the spark of the human soul is reincarnated into a non-human form, whether that is an inanimate matter, a vegetative matter, or animal reincarnation, it causes great anguish for the soul. When it causes great anguish for the soul, it gives the soul the ability to reflect on and figure out where it had gone astray, and as such, to make rectification for the different things that it did in this world. On a lighter note, they tell the joke about Yankel and Moshe, the 2 old friends that lived in the old village, in the old shtetl, who made a pact that whoever would die first would go visit the afterlife and would report back in a dream to the friend they left behind what it's like in the next world. Sure enough, Yankel passes away in a car accident. And a few weeks later, Yankel comes to Moshe in a dream. And he says, Moshe, you have no idea. The afterlife is absolutely incredible. I eat whatever I want. I sleep whenever I want, for however long I want. The sun is shining. I'm surrounded by green grass and incredible nature. It's absolutely amazing. Moshe says, wow, Yankel, I really cannot wait to come and visit you one day in heaven. Moshe, heaven? Who said anything about heaven? I have been reincarnated as a cow in Montana. All right. Yeah, that one was one of the weaker ones of the course. Okay, no worries. It happens. It happens. Sometimes my jokes are reincarnated as good jokes, and sometimes my jokes are reincarnated as non-human jokes. Anyways, fine. So why does God bring about the idea of non-human reincarnation? Sadly, at times, the soul needs some time of a reflective process to realize the damage that it did to the sparks that it contains. And in order to go through that process, it goes through non-human reincarnation in order to really and truly suffer. And it is that suffer that aids the process of rectification. Are there any questions before we move on to the next section of the class? Let's see what we got. Laura, does the soul control the person or the person control the soul? If the soul controls the person, doesn't it know it is supposed to and expected by God to improve? What a good question. What a good question. The truth is, we're going to talk a little bit about this in the second part of the class, but the reality is, Laura, that this question about reincarnation, really we could ask about any facet of Jewish belief or Jewish observance in life. Does the soul control the person? Does the person control the soul? The reality is God put the soul into a situation which it would not control. God gave the soul a mission and responsibility and said, you know what I'm going to do to make you fulfill that mission and responsibility? I'm going to put you into a situation where you will have very little say in the matter. You will try to exert your influence, but ultimately you have a body to contend with. You have outside influences to contend with. And as much as you know what you need to get done and you try to get that done, it ain't going to be easy for you. So granted, we can speak about that in the greater context of our mission in this world, but specifically about reincarnation, it's very frustrating for these soul sparks. They come down into this world with a very, very, very specific mission. They know exactly what it is that they're supposed to do in this world, as Laura says. And they come here with an agenda, and they're full of optimism and good energy, and they know what they want to do and how they want to get it done. And a lot of times, the circumstances that they are placed in make it impossible for them to achieve whatever it is that they are hoping to achieve. So, yes, Laura, that's a great question. Asks Myra, if a spark is part of an eternal soul, how can it be connected to simply a temporary nephesh form of animal? Excellent question, Myra, and that's a great point that I should add. When a human soul is given a term of non-human reincarnation, the human soul does not become the life force of that animal. For indeed, that's impossible, for a divine soul to be the sustaining force of a non-human item. The human sparks of the soul are sent to live in the non-human kind of as a penalty phase for it to reflect on the choices that it made in this world, but the life force of that animal is something else. A human soul cannot sustain a body, or any other non-human existence. It is sent back down into this world for the sparks to live in a sort of punishment phase in the non-human, but it is not the sustaining existence for the non-human creation. As you very correctly state, that would be somewhat impossible. Very good. Good questions tonight. I like it. I like it. I think you're all reincarnations of great Kabbalists. No, I'm joking, for it doesn't quite work like that. All right. Let's move along. Text 10. Let's read text 10 as a introduction to the next phase of class. Page 187 says Reb Moshe Cordovero, who was a later Kabbalist, it is impossible to deduce or intuit whether one possesses a reincarnated soul or not, unless one is the recipient of a mystical communication in this regard. You may wonder, how then will we know the purpose for which we enter this world? Which mitzvah we must scrupulously perform, or which transgression we must especially avoid? The answers are naturally ingrained in us. We experience natural affinity and longing to perform a certain mitzvah when that mitzvah is critical to our present incarnation, or our inclination strives especially hard to entice us to commit a particular sin, for it is the very same sin in which we blundered during our previous life. Many people, as we discussed earlier, when discussing the idea of reincarnation, have this very deep-seated passion to get to know the former version of themselves. I'd love to know who I was. What did I do? What was I like? What did I accomplish? What did I not accomplish? Or to put the question in more altruistic terms, what Laura just asked earlier in class, I'd love to know what I meant to do in this world. I'm going to spend, hopefully a long time banging around this world, just kind of, going around doing my thing. It would be lovely for me to know what it is that I'm supposed to be spending my time on. Where should I invest my energies and where should I not invest my energies? What should I be doing? Explains Jewish mysticism. Know this for starters. Your soul does not come into your body with any sort of pre-programmed DNA based on its previous existences. The way we understand the human experience of memory is not a spiritual existence. The soul doesn't remember things that happened to it in previous existences. So you will never know what you were in a previous world, short of, says Reb Moshe Cordovero, short of receiving a mystical communication in that regard. There are people who that information is shared with them, but that's not a common occurrence. However, says the Ramak, says Reb Moshe Cordovero, you may well figure out what exactly you are meant to be doing in this world in one of two ways. Either because of a strong urge you will have to perform a mitzvah, to do something good, or through a strong inclination, you will have to do the wrong thing. Either of those will be great indicators for you what you are meant to be doing or not meant to be doing in this lifetime, in this world, though we will never receive that communication clearly. And with that in mind, let's take a look at a fascinating letter that the Rebbe wrote. This is in text 11. It's a letter that was written in the early 50s to someone who was complaining about the status of their marriage. Says the Rebbe, I am replying to your letter in which you inform me that you accepted and are implementing my directives regarding Torah study classes and giving charity. But as far as the situation at home is concerned, your marital harmony appears only superficially to have improved, while the underlying reality remains unsatisfactory. I already told you in my previous letters that it would be challenging. You are meant to find it difficult. For the success of your life's mission hinges upon your sincere efforts towards marital harmony. Our mystical teachings reveal that rare individuals are born with original souls. The rest of us are reincarnations. We return to complete the fulfillment of the mitzvot that we missed in previous lifetimes. Certainly, we are obligated in all of the mitzvot, in every lifetime. But the specific mitzvot we omitted in earlier incarnations are critical to the rectification of our souls and the rectification of this world. Using the evil inclination as a guide, we can identify the mitzvot that determine the outcome of our life's mission. Our inclination opposes the mitzvot that we finalized in previous lifetimes, but only to the degree necessary to create free choice between good and evil. By contrast, it unleashes a fierce storm of opposition with countless hurdles and challenges when we approach a mitzvah that we failed to fulfill in previous incarnations. Therefore, your many hurdles to marital harmony reveal its indispensability to your rectification. Do whatever it takes to achieve harmony. With that in mind, let's take a look at this beautiful, beautiful meditation for tonight's class.
Today's reflection is going to help us try to relate to the idea that our souls came to the world this time around for a special purpose. A mitzvah, a good act that has special value in this lifetime. Now, how can we know such a thing? To a great extent, we can't. However, there's a way that we can catch a glimpse into what is important for the soul in this lifetime. And that is by way of a metaphor which we will now visualize. Picture in your mind's eye, you are leading an army out to battle. If the militaristic imagery is not to your liking, you can imagine a game of chess. Same idea applies. You're leading your army out to battle, and you begin to become aware that your opponent, your enemy, is focused on striking you in one particular spot. Now, it hadn't occurred to you that this spot has importance, but from the fact that the enemy keeps focusing on it, keeps going after it, you begin to realize that it must have strategic importance to the enemy. As you're imagining this, shift now and think about your life and think about a mitzvah or a good deed that is inordinately difficult for you. And by inordinately, what I mean is this. We all have mitzvahs that are harder and easier for all of us. But then there are mitzvahs that by all rights should be easy. It shouldn't be so challenging. And for some inexplicable reason, we just keep having resistance in that area. Why are we having inexplicably more resistance in that area? Why? Because it has that much more strategic importance, and therefore all things in the universe being counterbalanced. Our Maker has allowed a special resistance, a special challenge to give us pushback in that one area that we most need to overcome. So imagine, connect to yourself, think of yourself, think of that area, that mitzvah that's the hardest for you, the one that keeps on challenging you. And now imagine it, rather than as something that you're frustrated about, imagine it as your most precious asset. So precious that the enemy is specifically focusing on it. Let's take a moment to try to think of that mitzvah that is the most difficult, and to now see it as that mitzvah which in this lifetime is apparently the most important and most impactful. We'll take a moment now to envision this, to connect to this feeling. Feel yourself being empowered, knowing that this mitzvah has so much power, so much influence, and that is where the resistance is coming from.
I think it's very fitting. We're coming now from the Jewish holiday of Purim. In the story of Purim, fascinating, incredible, dramatic story of Purim, there's an idea very much connected to this sentiment. In the dialogue between Mordechai and Esther that takes place after Haman's decree to attempt to wipe out the Jewish people is ratified by the king, Mordechai tells Esther, look, you got to stop this. You got to go to the king and stop this. And Esther says, Mordechai, my dear, it's not so simple. I can't go to the king and stop it. I don't have carte blanche access to the king. I also have to be summoned. And if I'm not summoned, it's off with my head just as much as it would be with anybody else. What does Mordechai respond to Esther? Esther, have you ever considered the possibility that the entire reason that your life has transpired the way it has transpired, that you became the queen of Persia in the most ridiculous of circumstances, is specifically for this moment? We want to know what we were sent down into this world to do. Why don't we look at where we are and what we're meant to be doing? By taking a look at our lives with our struggles, with our challenges, with our strengths, and with our passions, explains Jewish mysticism, that will give us the best possible insight that we might need into what we are meant to be doing in this lifetime. Let's see this idea further expressed in text 12 on page 190. From the moment that God instructed our forefather Abraham, go from your land, Genesis chapter 12, following which it is stated, Abraham kept traveling further southward, the mystical process of the rectification of divine sparks was launched. Subsequently, by decree of divine providence, individuals traveled to the locations in which the divine sparks that these specific individuals must rectify await the redemption. Saintly individuals with spiritual vision perceive the locations in which their divine sparks await their engagement, and they take the initiative to journey to these locations. The rest of us are left in the hands of the primary cause behind all causes and the ultimate reason behind all reasons. God orchestrates countless apparent causes and circumstances to bring specific individuals to the locations in which their predestined service of rectification is required. So, we each have a personal mission in this world. Our souls were specifically sent into our bodies to live our lives for a very, very, very specific and individual purpose. What can we do to try and best guess what that purpose is, what that personal mission is? Explains Jewish mysticism. There are three things we should pay attention to: our strengths and our passions, Our strengths should be a positive indication of where we should be investing our energies. And our passions sometimes are negative passions, where we see where the opposition is focused, like we saw in the meditation, should be the strongest possible indication of where we're tempted. Our weaknesses and our struggles indicate where the bodies are buried in a certain sense, and our circumstances are the greatest possible indication and source of information for us of where we should be investing our energies to do the specific things that our soul was sent into this world to do. Are there any questions or comments or suggestions? Nothing and nobody. Okay. What we're going to do now, as we begin the wrap-up phase on tonight's class, we're going to revisit the little true and false exercise that we did at the beginning of class. Let's hop back to page 175. I didn't score you on true and false. We're going to use the honor system like we're using here for the coronavirus vaccine here in the state of Utah. We're going to use the honor system. I'm going to trust you to remember what you answered, and we'll see how your answers stacked up. Question number 1, belief in reincarnation is basic to Judaism. Well, let's put it this way. It is a basic belief of Judaism. Judaism fundamentally believes in the idea of reincarnation, but to say that in order to understand what Judaism is all about, one must believe in reincarnation, that would not necessarily be true. I think the idea that the reason why we are reincarnated is so that we may each go about fulfilling our specific mission and purpose. That is something which is central to Judaism. But to say that understanding reincarnation is central to Judaism, that might be a bit of a stretch, and we'll touch on that in a second. Who is Carlos? You have a question? Carlos does not have a question. Does anybody have a question? Okay, let's get into number 2. In the Jewish view, reincarnation means that a soul that inhabited one body returns to inhabit another. Well, not really. As we talked about, the actual soul that lives in one body never really gets recycled into another body. However, parts of that soul, facets of that soul, the sparks of that soul are what indeed get grafted onto another body in order that the second body discharge the missions of the first. Number 3, I'm going to get to all the questions in a moment. A human soul can be reincarnated in a non-human entity, such as an animal or a plant, as we clearly delineated tonight. That is absolutely correct in our belief system. A reincarnated soul does not have its own identity, but shares its identity with someone who lived in a previous lifetime. As we talked about again rather clearly, that is woefully incorrect. The identity that our soul had in a different body is not something that we tap into at any point in time, and our soul lives a very independent existence during its time on earth. Number 5, the purpose of doing good in one's current lifetime is to be reincarnated as a person of higher status in a future reincarnation. I would say that is woefully false. Woefully false. In a certain sense, the purpose of doing good in one's current lifetime is to make sure that one's soul is never reincarnated ever again. That's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to do all the good we can to elevate all those sparks to make sure that we are never reincarnated again. So coming back as someone of, quote, higher status is not exactly an ideal that we aspire to. Number 6, a soul is reincarnated as a penalty for sins committed in a prior life. Again, I would very cautiously stay away from the term penalty, and again, adapt the term that we used last week, which is rehabilitation. A soul goes through another lifetime so that it can be rehabilitated for the choices that it made the first time around. And lastly, most souls today are reincarnations. In plain and simple English, I would say that is absolutely correct. Cheryl, it seems like you have a question. Cheryl, I see you unmuted yourself. Is that for any particular reason or not? No. Okay. We had 2 questions coming via chat. Says Myra. Whoa. Hold on a second. I'm sorry. Okay. Do souls have gender? Are men only reincarnated as men and women only as women? Absolutely not. Souls are not gender specific. As we talked about earlier, the notion that sometimes souls have to come back in a male existence or a female existence to fulfill certain mitzvot that are unique to one gender over the other. Souls are absolutely not gender specific. Says John, if we don't know who we were before, how do we know that reincarnations exist? Very good question, John. Very good question. As we briefly alluded to in some of our texts tonight, these are existences that are known to people whose spiritual frequency is a lot more sensitive than our own. Indeed, these are not realities that were shared with us by people who went and came back. These are secrets of the Torah that were made known to very, very mystical figures and sages and leaders throughout our generations. And these are not things that people were saying by experience. This is, in a certain sense, certain prophecies that people experienced and shared with us. And so, no, none of this has ever been shared by lived existence where someone went in as one version and came back as another version and wanted to let everyone know how it was. This is all kind of divine intuition on a certain level. But good question, John. Anybody else before we wrap this up? Yes, Jennifer.
I have a question.
You very politely raised your hand on Zoom. I like that. Good. Yes, go ahead.
She's very
What-
studious.
Yes, I see.
Why do some people seem to suffer tremendously in this lifetime? I'm sure we all have friends, family where we've seen things repeatedly happen to them, and they're very good, amazing people, and you wonder why they were they seem to be dealt a very bad hand
Sure.
when they're amazing people. Like, let me reiterate that. But it's like one blow after another, after another, after another. And
Sure.
some people seem to have no suffering.
It's a great question, Jennifer, and it's one that's fundamental to our faith, and it's one that has kind of been at the center, I think, of our faith system and any faith system that's as old as time. And I'm going to give you the best answer that I have, and I'm going to provide the disclaimer that you're probably not going to like it. And that is that if I had a sufficient answer to that question, I would be the one who would be determining the suffering. Ultimately, God wants to have a system in place with us where things make absolutely no sense to us. And ultimately, in a certain sense, part of a faith system is acknowledging that there are certain questions which will be so eternally frustrating that we will absolutely never have a good answer to. Now, the reason why we struggle with this idea so much, and here's where I think we can provide some context, is because by and large, we see suffering and lack thereof as compensation for performance. And I noticed that in your question, Daniel, you talked a lot about amazing people, great people who suffer so greatly. And I think that the reason why that reality is so damning for us is because, you know who deserves suffering? Horrible people deserve to suffer, whereas abundantly good people should probably get a life of prosperity. I think the key idea that Judaism provides to that is that suffering in this lifetime should never, ever be viewed as a reward or a punishment. Everything which we endure in our lifetime here on earth, which actually really kind of ties into tonight's class, is all part of the divine journey that God gave us for our souls in this lifetime. Never ever confuse material prosperity or material suffering, for that matter, for divine love or lack thereof. What a soul is going through in this world is part of its divine mission. Now, for whatever reason, God, in his thinking, which he will never make clear to us, decides that certain people should go down that road, should be on that journey, and that journey should be a tumultuous one for them. That journey should be one which is going to endure abundant pain and suffering. And why is a question we will never have a good answer to. Because the moment we would have a good answer to that question, we would be on God's status, which would either diminish God's level of understanding or raise ours to a superhuman level. And that's not the mechanism that God has in place for us. And so ultimately, and we're going to finish with this idea, Jen, it's a great question that you asked at this point in class, but ultimately it's all about the journey. That's for whatever reason, and a reason that is deeply frustrating, one that we'll never understand. That is the journey that God had in mind for that particular soul. So I know that I didn't answer your question, Jen, but did I provide some sort of context for, why we're all frustrated without an answer? Okay, good. Asks Myra, what is left to contemplate past wrongdoings that require sparks to enter animals if the good parts of the soul are in paradise? Is the ascended soul incomplete as it's missing sparks? Yes, I think that's Mara, if you want to come on mic for a sec, I think that I might be missing part of the question as I read it, but yes, I think that's it's definitely an incompletion issue. Let's be clear about something. If a soul in its first version here on earth did something good, it never has to do that again. Those sparks go up on high and remain elevated forever. Granted, the soul in its next version will still be obligated in general mitzvot, but the good that it did remains good forever, and it needs to keep on focusing on the ideas it was not successful in the first time around, and then a second time around, then a third time around. But I would agree that the souls that are reincarnated into non-human existences, part of their souls are up on high. It's just an incomplete ascent. Yes. Myra, let me know if that was what you were looking for, and we will continue. Okay. Let's wrap this up with the following idea. As we talked about earlier, there are two general schools of thought as it pertains to reincarnation. Some people are fascinated by the idea of reincarnation. It gives them part of a larger identity. And in class tonight, we kind of talked about the fact that that's not necessarily true, because you're not connected to your past or to your future. All you have to do is live in the present. So it's interesting that Jewish philosophy's idea of reincarnation somewhat tamps down the great excitement of reincarnation from one perspective. On the other hand, we also talked about the idea that there are those that are very dissuaded by the idea of reincarnation because, why am I walking around carrying the baggage of those that came before me? Why can't I just live my life? And I think in a certain sense, Judaism's view of reincarnation actually speaks to that concern very, very, very specifically. To really kind of break it down, our idea of reincarnation, number one, enhances personal identity by providing a unique purpose. It reminds us that what the version of our soul and our bodies needs to do is so unique that no one that came before us ever did it. And hopefully those that come after us won't have to do it because we'll take care of it. So it gives us a unique sense of purpose. Number two, however, it also gives us the ability to stand on the credit of those that came before us because our mission can be augmented with previous good deeds, which is why ultimately the good that our soul accomplishes in this world is able to be joined together with other positivity, as ultimately they all do stem from one root soul. Judaism's view on reincarnation is a pathway to realizing God's master plan, to really realizing that although each one of us has a unique sense of mission and purpose, on the other hand, we all really are small cogs working as part of a tremendous master plan, which I think keeps us humble. And lastly, it gives us a role within the general human mission, tying into number one. We are not just another speck of humanity. We do something which is fundamentally important, and the world cannot continue to function without us and our unique contribution to the world around us. On a more mental health idea, this is a concept that was uniquely pioneered by the great American Jewish psychiatrist, who most of you probably have heard of, Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was one of those great minds of the previous century, who obviously his ideas and his thoughts were colored by his experiences. He was a Holocaust survivor. He had survived Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and other horrific Nazi death camps. And when he came out of the camps and ultimately made his way to America, he created really kind of an entire school of thought in the mental health world, which is pivotal and fundamental in the mental health space today, which he referred to as logotherapy. And this idea was obviously pioneered in his fundamental book, one of the greatest books ever written in terms of copy sold, Man's Search for Meaning, in which he pioneers this idea that an understanding of a unique sense of mission and purpose is integral to being able to lead a meaningful life. Let's read text 13 together from Dr. Frankl. Thus, it can be seen that mental health is based on a certain degree of tension. The tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. Such a tension is inherent in the human being and therefore is indispensable to mental well-being. We should not then be hesitant about challenging man with the potential meaning for him to fulfill. It is only thus that we evoke his will to meaning from its state of latency. Explains Dr. Frankl that approaching a person and saying, you have somewhere to get to, You, in your unique position in life, have somewhere to be and somewhere to get to that is uniquely you, that nobody else can get to that place in the entirety of human history. That idea is so fundamental to proper and appropriate mental health for a number of reasons. The awareness of a personal mission, first of all, it gives us a determination to attain a goal. Imagine if we went through life every single day just wandering aimlessly around. What are you doing? Oh, I don't know. Maybe a little bit of this, maybe a little bit of that. I don't know. I have no urgency. The determination to attain a goal, to go somewhere in our lives, gives us a purpose. It gives us a reason to get up every morning. Beyond that, it gives us strength to overcome obstacles. If you need to get from point A to point B, and in between point A and point B, there are a number of obstacles, unless you are dead set on getting to point B, those obstacles will stay in your way. The moment you have somewhere to go, you have the strength to overcome those obstacles. More importantly, I think it gives us a changed attitude towards a circumstance. Any part of life that we experience, anything that we go through in life, by viewing our existence as a journey from point A to point B to do something, to accomplish something, every circumstance in life is part of that journey and gives us something to do. Number 4, Jen, funny that you asked your question earlier. Here we are. It gives us the ability to find potential within suffering. Because if we don't have the potential within suffering, all we're left with is questioning and wondering and doubting and cynicism and negativity. But if we have somewhere to go, it gives us at least the potential to find something within our suffering. And lastly, it encourages us and it inspires us to seize every moment of every day. If we know where we are going, at what we are trying to do, every second of our lives, every moment of our day is another moment for us to seize it, to use it to its fullest, and to ultimately succeed to get wherever we are going. Let's conclude with the key points on page 196.
Lesson 5. Where we go again. 1. Adam possessed the Jewish master soul that ultimately branched out into the 600,000 souls that received the Torah at Mount Sinai. All subsequent Jewish souls are offshoots of these soul roots. 2. The 600,000 primary souls were each given a part of the world to perfect through fulfillment of the 613 mitzvot. When a soul accomplishes its mission, it itself also gains rectification and elevation. 3. Every root soul must also study each of the Torah's 4 layers of teaching and uncover its unique part in Torah. 4. Few, if any, of the original souls completed all 613 mitzvot, nor the required study during their original lifetimes. Reincarnation provides souls with additional opportunities to complete their missions and the rectification of the world and themselves. 5. When a person dies, all the refined elements of their soul return to heaven. A new soul, built from the elements that were left unrectified, is then grafted from the stem soul and returned to this world. 6. As a general rule, our souls are reincarnations, but it is impossible to be conscious of or to accurately sense the experiences of our previous lifetimes. 7. Clues to the nature of our soul's unique task in this world can be gleaned from A, our strengths and passions, B, our weaknesses and struggles, and C, our unique life circumstances. 8. The Kabbalistic view of reincarnation does not deny us our personal identity. Each of us is a complete and unique individual who is simultaneously and integrally linked to a far greater reality. Reincarnation ascribes greater importance to our existence and provides each of us a unique role within the overall human mission.
I very much hope you will be able to join us next week. You are the brave few that have survived so far all the way to the end. I hope you'll be able to finish strong with us next Monday, March 8th at 7:30 p.m. Lesson 6 entitled Life is Short-ish. Lesson 6 really is kind of a recap lesson. We've talked a lot about death and the afterlife and where our soul goes and where it goes again. Thank God we are all alive. All of you began this course with me 5 weeks ago, and thankfully you are all still here, and I hope that all of you will stay with us for quite some time. And so as we wrap up this course, we'll talk a little bit about life. Now that we know everything there is to know about death, how does that inspire our choices about life? That will be next Monday. There will be a recap email sent to you either tomorrow or Wednesday with a video recording of tonight's class. Thank you very much. Please feel free to reach out with any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions, and I will see you all next Monday. Have a great night. We will see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.